Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mbongiseni Buthelezi from the Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI. I would like to take this moment to thank you all for joining us this afternoon and to welcome you to this webinar. And I particularly want to thank people who joined us last week. Unfortunately, we had technical problems and had to postpone to this week. Thank you for joining us at such short notice, and thank you to the panelists who've made it again today. Let me start by just introducing briefly PARI before I hand over to Professor Jonathan Claren from the Wits Law School, who will introduce our partners in this event, the Mandela Institute at Wits. So PARI, as some of you who attended our previous webinar have heard, is 10 years old. We are linked to the University of the Witwatersrand and linked to the University of Cape Town. We do work on the state in South Africa and in other parts of the global South, trying to understand the political administrative interface, trying to understand state effectiveness, state efficacy. And our work on public procurement, if I can just trace it back briefly, it goes back, I think, to some of the early work that PARI did. In 2013, we published what has turned out to be something of a seminal report called The Contract State, on which my colleague Ryan Brunette, who we are going to hear from later, was the lead researcher, which showed that for the first time around 2000, South Africa shifted to being a state that outsources most of its work. It does this through contracting out its work, which is the subject of today's discussion. And so for that reason, it has meant that we need to think about the skills that are needed in the state differently, which is a subject for another discussion. Here today, we're focusing on public procurement. We are talking about large infrastructure projects in relation to the public procurement bill. As most of you know, the public procurement bill is out for public comment, and comments close at the end of this month. So this is the context in which we are holding this event. I'd like to, before I hand over to Jonathan, to just thank all the panelists who are joining us this afternoon. Thank them for their time, for being with us this afternoon, and for rejoining us after last week's, what was supposed to be last week's event that's happening now. And with that, may I thank also Jonathan Claren, who's going to be the facilitator this afternoon. He's also a long-time associate of PARI. Thank you, and over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you very much, Mbongiseni. Yeah, and as you've mentioned, it's been my pleasure to have been working with PARI more recently, so from about 2016. On several projects, and particularly on this procurement work. It's been really fruitful. I also work, as you noted, at Wits, at the Wits Law School. One of the units at the law school is the Mandela Institute, and that's the other organization that's co-sponsoring and putting together this workshop. The Mandela Institute works on issues of regulation, international trade. At one point it was described as all parts of the law that actually make money. It certainly, however, has an interest in the public interest and public policy. And its acting director at the moment is Feroz Kashalia, who's unfortunately not able to join us on this rescheduled date. Okay, so I think without too much further ado, let me put a couple of, oh, well, the other thing I've been fortunate to work on the PARI work with Ryan in particular, but my job in this seminar is not to be substantive, but really to be the facilitator and the moderator. So, so without any further ado, a couple of ground rules. One, for the attendees, we are going to have a period for question and answers. At the moment, we're looking at that probably somewhere around 3:20, so in about an hour and 15 minutes. Please put questions into the Q&A box the Q&A chat, and I will note those. You won't be able, I'm speaking to the attendees here, the attendees won't be able to unmute themselves. So your voice, your words will have to come through me. So I promise I'll read the question and answer as much as I can, and we'll try to distill the questions, put them together when we get to that part of the program. We're going to start with a presentation by Dr. Sean Phillips. We'll then pass to some comments from Dr. Miriam Altman. I'll introduce each of these people more fulsomely when it's their time. Then we'll go to Dr. Ron Watermeyer. Then Dr. Allison Anthony, lots of doctors here. The next person's actually studying to be a doctor, that's Ryan Brunette. And Mduduzi Mbada is actually our final panelist. We'll have the Q&A at that point. Okay, so that's the overview of the order of speakers. And I'm pleased to see we've got, over 60 participants at this point. So I'd also add my thanks to Dr. Mbongiseni Butalezi's thanks for rejoining us, or if you're joining us for the first time, that's great. So our first presenter, and together with Ron Watermeyer, the presentation, is Dr. Sean Phillips. Sean has honors degree and a PhD. He's also got a Master of Management degree and much government experience, senior management experience, acting, for instance, for 5 years as a head in the Limpopo Department of Public Works and Roads, and 5 years as a DG in DPME, the Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation. He's worked in infrastructure for a number of years, being a member of the CIDB board. I've heard him described as South Africa's chief engineer. He's currently working as the infrastructure fund manager at the DVSA. So, Sean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Hello, everybody.
Yes.
The paper is available on the National Planning Commission website, and our brief was to inform the NPC's review of progress towards the NDP vision, particularly with regard to what the NDP vision said with regard to infrastructure delivery and construction sector dynamism. So we looked at what the NDP said in terms of its targets for 2030, and we looked at how far we've gotten in terms of achieving those objectives and targets, and then we tried to do some assessment of what might be the reasons where we haven't met the objectives and targets as intended. We carried out the study by doing desktop reviews of documents, and we did some interactions with some subject matter experts. The study was relatively small, and the brief didn't include doing a complete stakeholder consultation with all possible stakeholders. We did interactions with a few subject matter experts. The paper particularly focuses on those aspects of infrastructure which are in the control of government. So key things that the NDP said about infrastructure is that public infrastructure does, from an economist point of view, enable the economy to grow faster and become more competitive and productive. It should lower the cost of doing business. It should provide jobs for skilled people, promote spatial inclusivity, and contribution to the elimination of poverty and reduction of unemployment and inequality. However, those noble economic objectives are only achieved if the delivery of infrastructure, the planning and delivery of infrastructure is managed well. If it's not managed well, the opposite can occur, and investment in infrastructure can become an impediment to, rather than enabler of economic growth, as we've experienced in South Africa with the 2 new large power stations. And poor delivery of infrastructure can also actually undermine broad-based Black economic empowerment. For example, small and emerging contractors suffer more when clients pay late or when they take a long time to make decisions related to projects because they haven't got the financial capacity to deal with such events. And badly managed infrastructure can actually result in an increase in poverty and inequality rather than a decrease. For example, when there's water shortages or an increase in waterborne diseases in communities due to badly managed wastewater treatment plants. Specific goals that the NDP put related to infrastructure were to increase gross fixed capital formation to 30% of GDP by 2030, to make public infrastructure investment become 10% of GDP by 2030, to have private funding for some of these investments, and particularly related to how infrastructure is delivered. The NDP said that in future, government should differentiate its approach to procurement of infrastructure from the procurement of other goods and services, and adopt a more strategic approach to procurement of infrastructure, should work towards building trust and understanding with suppliers, developing professional procurement capacity, and importantly, incorporating professional judgment into the infrastructure procurement process. And it also indicated that there should be a change and that the role of the procurement divisions in government organizations should play a supporting and enabling role to the operational line function, as opposed to the situation which was existing then, and we found in our research is still largely existing, where the procurement divisions under the CFOs in government organization tend to play the main role and even sometimes sideline operational line management in the procurement process with regard to infrastructure. So then we looked at performance against those targets, and we found that many of the targets had not been achieved. For example, the average contribution of the average expenditure on infrastructure between 1998 and 2017 was only 5.9%, which would require a huge increase in infrastructure investment to meet the 30% target by 2030 in the NDP. We also found that public sector investment in infrastructure as a percentage of total investment in infrastructure has decreased to the extent where in 2018 private sector investment in infrastructure and civil construction in particular exceeded public sector expenditure for the first time ever. And in addition, the NDP objective of having substantial private financing of public infrastructure has also not been achieved, and that the PPP regulatory framework and process has had rather disappointing outcomes, and that only 2% of public infrastructure is privately funded in South Africa, whereas compared to a country like the UK, for example, where 50% of public infrastructure is funded by the private sector. We also found that problems of under expenditure and simultaneous problems of cost overruns and time overruns on projects are still rife. And the figures are given in this slide, and they're in the paper as well. I won't go into them here. There's also been numerous studies which have shown that, contrary to the goals of the NDP, the condition of infrastructure across the country has generally not improved. And that quite a large swathe of our infrastructure has been rated by the South African Institute of Civil Engineers as not fit for purpose and at risk of failure. And so, some of these are types of infrastructure which are essential for basic service delivery, including bulk water services, water supply other than major urban areas, and wastewater treatment. We then tried to look at the reasons for these disappointing outcomes compared to the objectives in the NDP. And some of them are listed here, such as deteriorating government finances, which have resulted in less real spending, less real money available for expenditure on infrastructure, deteriorating state-owned enterprises' balance sheets, and those two factors resulting in a decrease in public sector investment in infrastructure. Corruption and state capture have played a part. And what we particularly focus on in the paper is a lack of improvement of infrastructure procurement, client delivery management, and infrastructure management generally in the public sector. We looked at some of the major mega projects which have happened over the last few years, and found that generally they've been characterized by large cost and time overruns, which is not unique to South Africa, with a couple of exceptions of large programs which have been implemented very successfully without large cost and time overruns, including the construction of the 2 new universities and the renewable energy independent power producer program. And we looked at differentiated these 2 relatively successful projects versus the other mega projects. And we found that we think that the key differentiator is the quality of procurement and client delivery management. And key aspects of that are that to deliver these large programs and projects successfully, it's very important to have client delivery management capacity with decision-making authority, which relates to the governance within the organization in terms of delegations for decision-making. And all the different aspects of the parts of the organization which are involved in the delivery of the project and infrastructure need to take ownership of it, and there needs to be a coordinated effort for the organization as a whole to ensure that all the different parts of the organization work together to enable the projects and programs to be delivered efficiently. Part of the capacity that's required and the governance is the need to have leadership by the client of the project at a sufficiently senior level to make sure that it is implemented well. And then finally, the approach to procurement needs to be strategic and it needs to be tactically sound. So the question then arises as to why hasn't there been much progress with improving infrastructure procurement, as was one of the objectives in the NDP. And we have identified in the paper a number of reasons. Firstly is that even though, as described in the paper, there have been quite a range of interventions at national level to improve infrastructure management and delivery across government, most of these are focused on program and project management and asset management practices, and we think that they haven't sufficiently addressed the issues of procurement and client delivery management. Some of them have made good progress in terms of providing knowledge, tools, and training and capacity building at provincial and local government level on asset management and infrastructure planning, and those have probably had impact in those areas, but we think that there's a gap with regard to infrastructure procurement and client delivery management in particular. One of the problems is that generally across government, despite the national interventions which have taken place, particularly in government departments, there is still a lack of differentiation of infrastructure procurement, and infrastructure procurement is still generally treated as much the same as procurement of other goods and services, and the procurement process is dominated by the supply chain management units who do things in a one-size-fits-all approach. That one-size-fits-all tends to be a very administrative approach of ticking of boxes with compliance with rules and not insufficient attention to the actual project outcomes and a general exclusion of professional input from the line functions from the procurement processes. Then there's quite a, as we know, there's quite a plethora of SCM regulations and practice notes which have been issued by National Treasury, and that has resulted in some confusion across government and differences in interpretation and understanding of what can and can't be done. Then there's still generally a lack of appropriate capacity, skills, and experience in specifying, procuring, and overseeing the delivery of infrastructure. And this is exacerbated when the line functions and the built environment practitioners in the line functions are excluded from a significant involvement in the procurement process by their supply chain management units. And then often there's a lack of appropriate delegations to empower client delivery managers to manage. So often in government departments and municipalities, the project managers for projects don't have the necessary delegations to make necessary decisions, and this often results in problems on projects in terms of delays of clients to make decisions, which in turn can result in cost and time overruns. So we recommend in the paper, the recommendations in the paper are to continue to try and implement the basic objectives which were in the original NDP, which is that infrastructure procurement should be differentiated from the procurement of goods and services, that professional involvement in the infrastructure procurement process, or at least the involvement of built environment practitioners, is important, and it should be encouraged rather than deliberately excluded. It makes the point that infrastructure procurement can be very complex, and that because of that complexity, it requires professional judgment rather than a tick box approach to decision making in procurement. And with regard to increasing private sector investment in public infrastructure, the paper recommends a review of the PPP regulatory framework based on the experience of the Renewable Energy IPP program, which would involve identifying sectors which are suitable for private sector investments, such as municipal infrastructure sectors, for example, which have revenue streams associated with them, and having national programs for private sector involvement in these sectors, rather than waiting for individual municipalities to propose PPPs. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. That's pretty much bang on time. So that was a presentation that was based on the paper that Ron and Sean have written for and under the auspices of the National Planning Commission. For the attendees, the web link, the resource page on the PARI website has got links to this background paper. Sean, I think, and Ron, it's about 106 pages or something like that, right? No. So that was a 15-minute condensation of it. We're actually, the paper itself, as you heard, did not directly address the draft procurement bill. And we will turn to that with Ron Watermeyer in a minute. But before that, we're going to take some comments and views from from Miriam Altman, who is a commissioner at the National Planning Commission and has worked with Sean and Ron on this project. She's an economist who's been in a number of leadership roles, first at HSRC. Recently, she's been convening the COVID-19 economist groups, aiming to identify certain solutions, aiming to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. She was part of the team that was writing the original and the first National Development Plan, NDP. And she still, as I mentioned, works at the NPC, working particularly on the areas of the economy, digital readiness, labor, SOE performance, and education. Has many publications, and I think also has many views and comments, which is what we will turn to now. Thank you very much, Miriam.
Okay. Thanks for that intro and for inviting us as the Planning Commission and for doing this, actually. I appreciate the work that PARI does, and it aligns to our thinking in the National Planning Commission, because we're very much wanting to focus even our economic review work, which is what I'm leading, around doables and around systems and state capacity, which I think, government has agreed that it's the #1 priority, but state capacity, in other words, but there really is very little attention to what to do about it. So Now, I should just also say that I tend to give my work history back for maybe a decade, but it's maybe a 3 decades long work history. And just to say, even in this area, I played an executive management role in Alexander Renewal Project and have been working with Sean since he was DG of Public Works around how you get system-wide public works expanded, and have been, we've been cooperating for many, many years. And I've been both sort of doing research at HSRC on this area, but also have been at the coalface of delivery. So just to contextualize that. And then to contextualize this work. So the National Planning Commission, of which I'm still a commissioner there, and our terms end in September. We've been doing an economic review for some time. And what that review does, it sticks very closely to our mandate. And it says, what did the NDP say about whatever it is we're looking at? So in this case, infrastructure. What happened? What's the gap between what was expected and what happened? And what do we recommend as course correction? And what we've asked all of the people who are doing work with us, and there are a whole series of papers coming out the door now, is to focus, as Sean and Ron did, is not so much on the big policy ticket issues, which it's not to say that we don't need policy reform, but I think there's little doubt that the most important thing right now is about state capacity and about strengthening government's vision around what to do, but also strengthening the voice of civil society to be clearer about what it would like to see. So we see that from both angles. And if you remember that the National Planning Commission is meant to be in the service of the nation, government, of course, but the full nation. Now, the work that Sean and Ron did for us is one piece within a broader set of work on infrastructure, if I can just say. So I'm sort of abusing my platform a little bit. So, okay. So the whole, if I can just say, because even in government, I did a presentation in the economic cluster this morning, and the presentation was meant to be on SOEs. And it was almost like I was sliding in the infrastructure stuff with it. And questions were asked, why are you sliding in the infrastructure issues with your discussion on infrastructure SOEs? And, we've got to look at this thing as a holistic issue because, historically infrastructure was, in the state would have been delivered by the state. And then increasingly it's procured. And then we have state-owned enterprise. And then increasingly there are methodologies to bring in PPPs. And a whole range of public-private arrangements. And all we want to figure out is how do we get more and better infrastructure that enables the goals of the National Development Plan. And we are looking at whatever angle can enable to do that. Now, this work on infrastructure that Ron and Sean, that Sean just presented, and then Ron's inputs into the procurement bill are aligned across government, as we know. Now, some of the response to that work is sometimes, even among some of my colleagues on the Planning Commission, will be, well, and you have to remember also, I was head of strategy at Telecom, so I'm very aware of this. You can get exceptions. Telecom falls under the PFMA, so you're constantly applying for exceptions. And, an ESCOM, when it wants to build, can get an exception. But the point is, you're not supposed to regulate by exception. You're supposed to decide how you want to do it and then do it. You're not supposed to be operating in such a way that you have a set of rules that then you're always trying to get around and apply for exemptions for. And unfortunately, what's been happening in the state generally around small business regulation, infrastructure, and so on, is that you get things done by virtue of applying for an exemption. And that is not good regulatory practice. So we're trying to influence that. Now, the second part of this work is around infrastructure SOEs, which is not what we're talking about today, but certainly relevant. And I just wanted to make people who are here, so I'm sort of, I hope that I did speak with the organizers, but I do want to make people aware that we, as the NPC, have issued a paper on SOE infrastructure, SOE performance, governance, and market structure. And we did 3 case studies on ESCOM, PRASA, and Transnet. as a segue to looking at how to do this for all the major infrastructure SOEs. So that is also on the NPC site, and I'll share. I think that, you know, the organizers have the link, but I'll put it into the chat insofar as anybody can see it. And we would welcome commentary. We've put these papers out for commentary. And again, what we did was we said, what was the bigger development goal? And that's exactly what Sean just did. So we've been working with Sean and Ron over the past year to hone in, and you can see how we asked the question in the infrastructure paper. What is the bigger development objective, say around energy and transport? What is the role of the SOE within that? What should the SOE therefore be delivering as against what the NDP goals should have been? What was in the shareholder compact and what was actually delivered? So what those papers do is they lay out what that is, and then they say, and then they look at issues around governance again, and different ways of delivering to these goals. Now, what I would ask is, and urge is anyone who's interested in that, I would be grateful, or we would be grateful, if people would firstly access those documents, circulate them, and most certainly weigh in and comment on those documents. We would be absolutely grateful. I think also what would be helpful within that is there are different ways that the state can interface with the private sector, as we know. Procurement is one of them, but there are also financial arrangements and delivery modes through the value chain. And we would be grateful for that kind of engagement. The reality is the procurement, because the procurement bill is coming up, it is so critical and so important on so many levels, and particularly in relation to the delivery of infrastructure, and we see this as a binding constraint, that certainly we'll look forward to the feedback from this session. Can I just ask, did the organizer share the link, or do you want me to type it in? So I'm done.
Great, thank you, Miriam. What we've shared is the link to the PARI resource page on procurement, where we've linked to those NPC SOE papers, the four, I think the four, yeah, there's a synthesis paper and then 3 other ones.
And if I can just say, the position paper becomes the most important one because that becomes the NPC position. So if I can draw people's attention to, it's a shorter paper of about 15 pages, and then we have background papers, and then we have the infrastructure paper. So the NPC position paper is the summative one that then becomes the NPC view. Just so people are aware.
Yeah, Miriam, if I can just ask on that. So does the NPC synthesis paper, which relates clearly to the SOE papers, the state-owned enterprise papers, does it also synthesize from this infrastructure paper that Sean and Ron are presenting?
It doesn't. What we have, and if I could just use the terms so that it's clear, because when you get to the website, we posted a lot of papers at once. So there's 4 papers that were presented for us by Genesis Analytics. And one is on performance, one is on governance, and the other one is on market structure. And then they prepared a synthesis paper called synthesis paper. So those are the views of Genesis, and that was an input. And we had a range of other inputs. The NPC then produced a position paper, and that's separate. The synthesis paper was written by Genesis, and that's great. We asked them for that. But the NPC position paper will become the view of the NPC. So we would, for this crowd, you will find those background papers, I think, very interesting. They're fantastic papers, and you will probably be able to engage with the detail of it. But we would urge you also to really look at the NPC position paper to see what you agree with and give us comments, because that would ultimately be the official paper that comes out. And I'm not discouraging people from reading the background papers. I just want to be clear on the differentiation. The infrastructure paper, we have not come up with a position on it, although we broadly agree with it. That will go into, along with the SOE papers, we're preparing a broader review that will come out in about a month or 2. But
okay.
Yeah, but there's nothing in the infrastructure paper that we would disagree with. We were pretty much on board with that and want to share it and get feedback.
Great. Yes, and we appreciate your participation and understand that you'll have to go at some point fairly soon.
Yes.
Great. What we'll do is also on the PARI procurement resource page, we'll update it and clarify it, and also link to that position paper that you're referring to now, which I don't think we have on there yet.
Oh.
Great. So we'll continue now with a presentation. We've just had Sean on the actual NPC infrastructure paper. And since the title of this workshop is Unpacking Infrastructure Delivery in relation to the draft procurement bill, we'll now turn to Ron Watermeyer, and we'll continue effectively the main presentation, and particularly beginning to look at the paper in relation to the procurement bill. So Ron will be claimed here by Wits as our own. He's got a couple of degrees from here, but he's been working with public sector clients in the procurement and delivery of infrastructures for a long time. He's really changed construction methods from Soweto to elsewhere, serving now as a technical advisor to the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee. I've mentioned his position as a visiting adjunct here at Wits. He certainly helped PARI quite a bit in commenting on some of our policy and paper developments along the way, which we appreciate, and has he's led through publications and thought leadership in this area. So Ron, over to you now.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the intro. I take it my presentation is visible now. Is it visible?
Yes, Ron, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I think, look, we've got to try and link now to the procurement bill. And I think if you look at the final impact assessment template of the procurement bill, it states that the bill expands upon the NDP's focus on efficiency and effective public procurement systems and contextualizes the strategic role of SCM in service delivery and social objectives. Sean has already gone through the contents of the National Development Plan in terms of some of the issues that it raised around differentiating of the different types of procurement, the adoption of a strategic approach, and so on. So I won't repeat them. What I think the starting point is, if we looked at the findings of our national NDP background study, is greater efficiency in government expenditure on infrastructure has not been achieved. We're seeing consistent underspending. We're seeing deterioration in things rather than greater efficiency. The focus, as Sean had pointed out, is on procedural compliance, which places an excessive burden on weak support functions rather than value for money, and this has increased rather than decreased, as was envisaged in the NDP. The identified crisis within the public sector relating to the lack of professional built environment expertise to plan, specify, procure, and oversee, in other words, government's functions, has worsened due to inappropriate SCM practices which marginalize such expertise. Despite all the procurement reforms and improvement initiatives, because what we did is we looked at all the initiatives that had been put in place, compared that against the overall performance, and concluded that the fundamental issues relating to delivery of infrastructure remains unchanged, and hence course correction was necessary. Now, looking at the procurement bill, just some high-level observations. And in the limited time available, I'm only going to focus on a couple of issues. The primary objective for procurement is that it uses procurement to leverage empowerment opportunities and ensure value for money in the use of public funds. Now, interestingly, there are three definitions provided for value for money. The first one, which relates to probably 75 to 80% of procurement spend for general goods and services, increasing output for the inputs used, which is really around lowest price for satisfying, adjusted for a preference, satisfying requirements of specifications in a single transaction. Then a second category that I would look at, it defines in relation to infrastructure the optimal use of resources to achieve intended outcomes. Now, I get it that only between 18 and 23% of procurement spend is infrastructure, but it does create a space for infrastructure to have a different view what value for money is. And optimal will speak to the most desirable possible outcome from the use of resources in the face of risks, etc. And it focuses more on the outturn project cost rather than an initial tender price. And then we've got a third category, which is in relation to public-private partnerships. And there I understand that we have about 2% of infrastructure procurement spend takes place in this category. And there we're looking at value for money resulting in a net benefit to the relevant institution with respect to cost, price, quality, quantity, risk transfer, and so on. So in essence, the procurement bill is trying to deal with, broadly speaking, 3 different categories of procurement with very different characteristics. I'm sorry, okay, turn. Now, very interestingly, the procurement bill defines procurement very, very narrowly as the acquisition of goods, services, or infrastructure by purchasing, renting, leasing, or other means. What this really is focusing procurement on a buying function, in other words, the first category. Now, I understand that most of procurement is in this category, but it has contextualized things in a very narrow space. Now, it also uses the term procurement professionals and supply chain management practitioners. Now, what precisely is a procurement professional and what exactly is a supply chain management practitioner? If we do look at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, the world's largest organization dedicated to the profession, they have different levels of competencies and they have chartered or professional status for their members. And if you glance through the various positions that they're talking about, it's very much around a buying function and very much around the acquisition of goods or services. Now, the bill does require the establishment of procurement units to implement functions allocated to the unit in the Act and supply chain management system. It also deals with the detail of supply chain management, and this is where I find a few difficulties in reconciling procurement as narrowly based acquisition with supply chain management, which suddenly pops in. And it prescribes a procurement system for basic goods and services and allows a more strategic procurement on an exceptional basis, something which Miriam raised. A principle-based, flexible and enabling approach to the regulation of procurement would have been preferred, in my view. The Act also has very detailed requirements for PPPs based on current practice, which, although being robust, have had a very limited impact. And we believe a more flexible and supply-driven approach should be pursued. Now, one of the reasons why I've raised this is perpetually, in going through the study that Sean and I did, we found in many, many instances the marginalization of built environment professionals in the whole procurement space. And if we look at it differently from infrastructure point of view, in infrastructure, procurement is frequently defined as the process which creates, manages, and fulfills contracts. In other words, it recognizes there's a planning phase. It recognizes there's an acquisition phase. It recognizes a contract management phase. So in other words, it takes a far broader view of what procurement is. Quite interestingly, if you look at the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide and you look at the ISO 2021-500 guide to project management, you will see that these guides deal with procurement as one of the knowledge areas in the 3 phases that I have just described. In other words, procurement is an integral part of project management. If we then look at the councils for the built environment, in their submission of work identification to the Competition Commission, which by the way was turned down, but what they wanted to do was to identify or reserve work for procurement. And what I've picked out of all of the submissions, all of them contained aspects of procurement, the management, procurement policies, assisting formulation of strategies, procurement documents as an integral part of the built environment professions. So one can conclude that procurement is a central competency of those responsible for delivering infrastructure. Now, coming back to the bill, if you look at the bill deals with supply chain management, with demand management, acquisition management, and defines procurement to sit purely in the acquisition category, and touches upon contracts and contract administration, logistic management, and there I've sketched out a typical supply chain. In general goods and services, you'll have, in general goods or in general services, you might just have demand management, procurement. Off-the-shelf products, you'd have demand management, sourcing, purchasing, receipt of goods, storage, issuing of goods. The bill is mostly designed around that. When we come to the infrastructure side of things, as Sean was explaining, delivery management involves planning, specifying, procuring, overseeing delivery, very different supply chain. And I think risk is the differentiator between the two systems. Now, what is of concern is in Chapter 7 in the Procurement Bill, the current provisions are very open-ended for infrastructure because it's reliant on instructions relating to an unknown infrastructure procurement and delivery management standard. There's just no detail, there's simply just a reference to it. Now, we don't know if that is going to, the approach to the standard is going to be a rigid rule-based prescriptive approach, a principle-based, or a process-orientated law. We don't know. Now, if we start thinking about how different procurement and delivery management paradigms could be formulated in such a standard, we need to think a little bit carefully about this, because we can have an administrative paradigm where everything is rule-driven, which was the traditional approach to procurement, very much a buying function. Poor outcomes result from that. We can go to a management framework where we provide a wide range of delivery options, routes, and methods, enabling a strategic approach, or we can go to a governance paradigm where we enable alignment of projects and procurement choices with organizational strategic values. And that's the modern approach that we see emerging internationally. So where is this standard going to be pitched? Administrative or governance? So to try and conclude, we believe that Chapter 7 needs to embed the principles for infrastructure procurement and delivery management, not just merely refer to some standard that we have no understanding of it. So we believe that accounting officers and accounting authorities in organs of state need to put a system in place, apart from leveraging empowerment opportunities, must provide effective governance processes which enable the organization to take ownership of delivery and manage it as an enterprise, as an integrated whole, not a series of silos, because projects have got to be dealt on an integrated basis. Provide for clear delegations of authority, provide control frameworks which include decision gates and enable risks to be proactively managed to assign single point accountability to a suitably qualified and experienced built environment practitioner to provide executive leadership, provide options which support an appropriate range of strategies, and provide a range of procurement tactics to enable strategies to be implemented. One also needs to make use of the skills and expertise of registered built environment professionals. The last thing I wanted to just leave with is the definition of infrastructure is very vague, because it's no good just building infrastructure. You need to have a completed functional facility. And just to illustrate this, I've put in a box there in the first phase of the new universities, all the procurements that took place. 219 contracts put in place, 19,000 items of furniture, all of these kind of things. And if that is not in place, facilities can't open. So infrastructure needs to include the delivery of a fully functional facility, and infrastructure procurement needs to be recognized as a central competencies of those for delivering infrastructure. You can't divorce management and infrastructure from each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, thanks very much. I think that turns us and really brings us from your study into the discussion of the draft procurement bill. I'm going to turn in just a second to Allison Anthony, but before that, I just want to, we've got over 70 participants at this point, and just to mention, if you're not aware, there's a robust question and answer dialogue already beginning to happen in the Q&A. So you might take a look at that. But I think, Ron, that sets us up very well. Allison, I'll introduce you with a doctoral degree on construction procurement. You're currently, she's currently lecturing at the University of South Africa. She is, I believe the position is the Deputy Director of the African, I might not be getting it exactly right, but a unit on researching throughout Africa public procurement policy. And about 2 days ago, published, am I getting it there? Yeah, published that piece, which is online and is on our, well, there's a link to it from our, I'll just read that. South African Infrastructure Procurement under the new Public Procurement Bill. That there's a link to that publication by Allison on that PARI page. Allison, your comments and views?
All right, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the invitation to join this webinar. Like I said, I was very disappointed that we couldn't carry on last week, but I'm glad to be here today. So my expertise lie in the legal side of things. So that's more where my focus will be. But I draw from both Ron and Sean's presentations. And for a while, for a long time, I've been mentioning much of what Sean and Ron have discussed, and I've published about this that the attendees can have a look at. I believe it's all on Google Scholar. The issue of infrastructure procurement being very different from just the procurement of normal goods and services, and that really needs to be acknowledged, not only verbally, but legally as well. In the rules, it needs to be recognized and acknowledged that this is a different type of procurement. You know, based on its complexity, it needs to be treated differently as well, including legally. So what I've been thinking of is, you know, what are some of the things that we can do to correct all of these issues that are mentioned in Ron and Sean's paper? You know, what are some of the reasons for lack of delivery and this bad procurement that we have that leads to failure of delivery? And I've sort of created a little bit of a list. I don't want to call it a checkbox list because that is what we're trying to move away from. But it's just sort of a list of things that I thought that we could look at in order to improve delivery, but really also focuses on the laws. I mentioned this in the paper as well that you just showed, Jonathan. So first and foremost, I think we need to fix the laws. We need to fix the laws when it comes to procurement in general, and then the laws with regard to infrastructure procurement. So what do I mean by this? We're now sitting with the Public Procurement Bill, which Ron mentioned. I've got it right here next to me. It's all of 3 pages long when it comes to infrastructure. So we've all been waiting for this piece of law for many, many years. It comes out and I'm so excited the day I receive this, and I think half of it has to be infrastructure, you know, because it's such a huge part of procurement in South Africa, such a huge part of our GDP, so much expenditure. And needless to say, I was extremely disappointed to see that it's so quickly dealt with so quickly in the procurement bill. So I completely agree with Ron that there really needs to be more in there, you know, and more substantive regulation regarding infrastructure in Chapter 7. He's also right that some of the definitions, just from a legal point of view, are problematic. Now, this is also a problem that goes back a couple of years, where much of the definitions in the CIDB prescripts contradicted that in procurement laws. So before we even fix, you know, what we call delegated legislation, in other words, the prescripts published by National Treasury and the CIDB, we need to fix the general procurement laws first, and that's what we're trying to do now, because everything else needs to align with that. So firstly, once this public procurement law bill has been sorted out, then the next step would be to clear the contradictions and align the laws which regulate infrastructure procurement to the general public procurement rules. At the moment, in my view, they are completely contradictory. And what makes it worse is the, in my opinion, parallel system that has been created between the CIDB prescripts and the National Treasury rules that have been published. That is the Standard for Infrastructure Procurement and Delivery Management, which has been repealed and is now the framework for infrastructure delivery and procurement management. I think I'm saying it correctly. It's very long names for these documents. I've also written a paper on the legal nature of these rules that are being published all the time. It's also in the African Public Procurement Law Journal, published about 3 weeks ago or so, where I talk about the legal nature of these rules that are being, in my opinion, effectively just being published willy-nilly. In my view, legally, the CIDP is the body that is there for the regulation of construction procurement, and any rules which they publish should then regulate construction or infrastructure procurement. So that would be the first step in correcting the huge process of getting infrastructure procurement streamlined and working better. In the second instance, the buzzword capacity. So capacity building, now what do we mean? What do I mean specifically? And it includes upskilling. I always use the sentence, it means putting the right people with the right qualifications in the right job, and they need to understand correctly what the job is. Now that's, I think, probably the most sensitive part of the list that I've written here, because that might lead to a lot of job losses. But it doesn't necessarily have to, because that's what upskilling and development is for. You know, you identify somebody that is not quite where they need to be, and you intervene in order to correct that and upskill them to get them to the point where they need to be. So that would be getting the right people, your procurement professionals, with the right qualifications in the right job. That would already correct much of what is wrong at the moment as well. If I'm looking down at some of the notes I've been making while they've been talking. Then something Ron also mentioned, and that's in the paper, is professionalizing procurement and infrastructure procurement. You know, for the longest while, procurement is, or supply chain management as it's more generally known, or supply chain management is something where people have been put, you know, if they are perceived to not be able to perform in a specific job, they are put in the supply chain management department, you know, and so it's been treated over many years. And I think that's part of the reason why we have many people that are not necessarily up to date with what's going on in procurement. So it would be very important to also professionalize the job of procurement. Ron also mentioned, you know, internationally there are bodies which regulate public procurement. You know, there's something, we should have something like that in South Africa as well. If you look at other professions like medical doctors and attorneys, we have codes of conduct and certain levels of behavior that's required of us. And should you fall short of that, there are real consequences, and that's also where consequence management comes in. You know, and that leads to a lot of political will. So it's, you know, it's a very complex approach that is needed in correcting everything. Then in the fourth instance, understanding the job. Now, understanding the job is also something Ron mentioned, is that it's not a checkbox transaction, but what I call a relational process. You know, it's understanding that everybody involved in the procurement process is a chain in a long link. You know, we all link into one another, and you need to understand that your job is not removed from that of the previous person or the next. It's all interlinked in order to produce the infrastructure that we're trying to produce or deliver at the end of the day. So I think that understanding is important, because the checkbox paradigm is that, you know, I need to do A, B, C, D. When I'm done, I hand it over and it's the next person's problem. You know, so one needs to understand your role in a bigger process, and that we all play a role in delivering this infrastructure, and that it's not just a transaction, but actually a relational process. Then also understanding the law is naturally very important, and understanding that it's not just rules that you have to comply with. Once again, that checkbox paradigm or attitude, but that it's a value-based process. I mean, if we look at the Constitution, Section 217 of the Constitution is the provision that regulates procurement, all kinds of procurement, including infrastructure. And it says that when government contracts for goods and services, including works or infrastructure, they should do so in accordance with a system that is fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, cost-effective. Now, all those principles are repeated in all the rules and legislation that regulates procurement. But we really need to understand the content of those rules. What is expected of me as a practitioner, practically? What is required of me to be transparent, to be competitive, to be equitable? You know, and really help everybody understand that this is a value-based relational process and not just a checkbox, so to speak. So that's more or less what I wanted to mention. But the other important thing is also the transformational issue that Ron brought up, the triple PFA, as we call it, the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act and its regulations, which I think is also due to be challenged soon. You know, transformation is obviously a very important thing in South Africa, and one of the main parts or elements or factors of procurement. But the law as it is at the moment doesn't quite adequately, in my opinion, provide for full access to transformation in South Africa in government contracts. And what is especially sad in the procurement bill is that this is not addressed at all. You know, it's mentioned, but the specific way in which transformation will be brought about or applied or implemented in the procurement process is not mentioned at all. So it would have been nice if we had the regulations where these rules will probably be included if they were published along with the act. So it's very difficult to determine how this will change and how organs of state and contractors will need to comply with transformation rules, because we don't have those rules available. So I think there's much work to be done on the procurement bill, but that would be the start in fixing everything, in my opinion. Yeah, and that's basically what I wanted to mention.
Great. Thank you very much, Allison. I think you know, your discussion about the relational view as opposed to the checkbox or the tick box view really can, you know, when you look at infrastructure, that 18 or 20% of spend that Ron was talking about as a set of relationships and suppliers that's quite intense. But of course, that relational view can also be applied, maybe a little less directly, but also applied to goods and to services. So there's lots there to talk about. Thank you. That's very much a legal view on the bill. I think that'll help us transition right now to Ryan, to your comments and views, which will be, I don't want to quite say politics, but bureaucracy, public administration, there we go. So Ryan Brunette is a research associate at PARI. Wits would claim him as its own, at least in part. He was, as Mbongiseni has mentioned, the lead author of the report called The Contract State, Outsourcing and Decentralization in Contemporary South Africa, which I think very much, as Mbongiseni was mentioning, was a kind of breakthrough for civil society, at least the, you know, other than say directly in the construction sector, to be concerned with the issues of procurement, beginning to understand it. He's been authoring the position paper on procurement. He's now looking more broadly in his PhD work at CUNY in New York City on the development of public administration and how bureaucracies are intertwined and embedded with their social context. So Ryan, co-author, over to you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so I mean, I just want to make, I guess, 3 broad points, and I'm going to try to make them relatively quickly. I mean, first, I just want to highlight that this discussion is happening in the context of a major economic crisis. It seems likely that we're headed towards the deepest annual economic contraction in South African history. We're going to need an activist state to lift us out of that. Declining aggregate demand must be met by counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Economic expansion, however, as it has been over the last decade and more, will be significantly constrained by major infrastructural problems in electricity, water and sanitation, roads, rail, ports, and so on. So any kind of counter-cyclical fiscal policy will need to have a big infrastructural component. But yeah, we run into the problems raised by Ron and Sean and others, massive problems of underexpending broadly poor infrastructural outcomes. This is something we're going to have to get right. The second point is that there are powerful political forces working against us getting it right. And these forces are expressed in a very specific way in infrastructure. Historically speaking, when the ANC came into power, there was a justifiable need to assert democratic control over the public administration. Political appointments were an important way to do so. But it is difficult to make political appointments into the key infrastructure delivery functions, such as electricity, water, sanitation, roads, etc., as these are socially and economically essential functions that require highly specialized and scarce expertise to operate. Expertise that aren't widely available in political circles. So the way in which the assertion of political control has happened here, or rather, political appointment and control has across the state run up against these sorts of pockets of professionalism which are on the main infrastructure functions. And you know, the way in which political control has been asserted has been to strengthen regulatory oversight and to remove crucial operational powers, decision-making powers from these functions into new and expanded support functions, such as human resource departments, supply chain management units, bid committees, and so on. Crucial consequence of this solution has been a growing disconnect between decision-making and the expertise that are needed to make the technically right decisions. Partly, I don't think National Treasury has expected this, but by empowering public finance departments, CFOs and so on over public procurement, the National Treasury has often provided regulatory resources for effecting this disconnect, which has been increasingly used for unexpected, let's say, purposes, right? So decision-making has in the process become increasingly corrupted. Political powers of appointment have been, political powers and appointments have been freed to range across administrative procedures, across segregations of duties, checks and balances. And this has allowed, this has provided opportunities for people to extract resources from the state and distribute them through what have become large-scale patronage structures, running into the wards of South Africa. The third point is that this situation is now unsustainable. In order to lift the economy out of this current economic crisis and avoid a deep and protracted recession, we need to start addressing these issues that Ron and them have suggested. And we can only do so incrementally, I'll argue, gradually. And we can only do so by beginning to insulate decision-making from the sorts of political dynamics that I've described, right? And in public procurement, or rather in infrastructure procurement, what that means is that real decision-making powers need to be returned to infrastructure delivery professionals. So to some extent, the kind of hold of bid committees and supply chain management units on infrastructure procurement needs to be loosened, right? They need to play a more oversight role rather than a direct decision-making role. And as I've suggested, importantly, although this doesn't come naturally to the South African administrative tradition, we're not going to be able to return these powers to infrastructure departments all at once. Right? There are profound political interests in that not happening. We need to, and we can start moving these powers back into infrastructure delivery departments gradually, right? We can move specific kinds of procurement back into these departments. We can move those decision-making powers in specific organs of state back to those departments. So the idea is that we can start to move parts of the procurement system into a new system or into a new regime bit by bit, one at a time, right? What this means is that the bill needs what I've been calling a covering in provision, right? A provision which gives the president the power by proclamation to move parts of the procurement system into a new legal regime, right? And the effect would be to, by giving infrastructure professionals, delivery professionals, expanded powers over infrastructure delivery, what we'd be doing is kind of leveraging the pockets of professionalism that the state does have as an additional kind of check and balance on problems that are widely experienced of political interference or illicit political interference and so on. So I think I'll leave things there. And I think we're going to open things up for discussion soon.
We are, not quite yet, but we are going to open it up for discussion. Thank you very much, Ryan. I think for unpacking some of those bureaucratic dimensions, administrative dimensions, and more political dimensions there. Yes, we are going to be opening up for discussion in about 10 minutes, but we're first going to be hearing from Mduduzi Mbada, who is going to be our last panelist. Thank you very much. I think he's probably most firmly in the political world at the moment of the panelists who are here. He's the head of policy research and the advisory services unit in the Office of Premier at the Gauteng province. That means I've already got one question in the Q&A queued up for you, Mduduzi, something about Gauteng property, but let's hear your comments and views first. We also, just because that's a theme, claim you as a Wits own, seeing a degree in public management from Wits. But thank you very much for joining this, and we look forward to some comments and views from you, sir.
Thank you very much to PARI, and thank you to you, Jonathan. I think firstly, we're grateful for the opportunity to join this session. It's very, very important to talk about, I think, in the main, the use of infrastructure to transform the economy, but also the use of infrastructure to build the kind of society we want. One of the things we did in Gauteng just prior COVID-19, in February this year, the Premier outlined what we consider to be the most bold plan, which was the Gauteng, Growing Gauteng Together plan of action. What we did, especially because there are colleagues from the National Development Plan, of rather the NPC, was just to say to ourselves, what is the kind of Gauteng we want by 2030? What should be the contribution of Gauteng on the kind of society we want in South Africa? And this is also because Gauteng contributes the largest in the economy in terms of GDP, but also more than 25% or so people reside in Gauteng. But what is it exactly we need to invest in to make sure that that society that we envisage is realized? One of the critical elements was to look at infrastructure as an element of transformation, but as an element of modernization, but as an element of industrializing and re-industrialization, not only of Gauteng, but of South Africa and the rest of the continent. Primarily because we think Gauteng is the gateway to the rest of the continent and indeed the world. So it is in that context that we thought we need to look at infrastructure as an enabler to transforming the economy, but as an enabler to spatially integrate communities and spatially integrate the economy, because we know for a fact that the economy for the longest of time has necessarily been fragmented. we then thought to ourselves, in order to get to that kind of society, we need to embark on a very scientific process, and that required modeling and scenario planning. We looked at the in-calamity scenarios from a perspective of investing in infrastructure, and realized that some of the bold views that I think Sean raised about what the NDP envisage in using infrastructure would be ideal for us. And we learned this from the investment we made boldly in building the Gauteng, and of course the road network that working with national government for over a period of time, albeit the problems of ETOPS, that it's things that are ongoing conversations between ourselves and national government. For an example, if we are to do some of the things that I think Sean raises that are not necessarily in the bill, the procurement bill, we need to come up with something that we call an infrastructure book. That infrastructure book should be used as a point of engagement with investors, both public and private. And that's why one of the things we did working with the DBSA and the African Development Bank was then to invest in what we call just project preparation, investing in ensuring that our projects are ready for market, are ready for investment. And this was because we knew that at some point there would be problems in the fiscus. We might not be able to spend enough money, or we might not have money in our fiscus, and therefore what do we do to work with the private sector or to attract DFIs in partnering with us to solve this problem of infrastructure. And I think that has largely yielded results. We are seeing a number of partners coming on board to assist us solve some of these big problems that we have around the infrastructure. So critical to infrastructure for us, other than what the bill is raising now, is the immediacy. What is that immediacy? Our investment in public health infrastructure. COVID-19 has made it possible for us to bring back, or rather bring forward, some of our infrastructure investment plans with regards to health. That includes not just maintaining, but building new hospitals that necessarily will respond to the immediate need, but on a very long-term basis, sustain our investment in quality infrastructure, particularly with regards to public health. That includes investing in what we call the special economic zones, because they themselves are not just, it's not just about construction, it's also about manufacturing, or looking at manufacturing value chain, so that we can be able to get as many participants as possible in that aspect of the economy. And I think the SEZ in Tshwane, in partnership with the city of Tshwane, national government as in treasury, is yielding results. And then you can see that outside of the procurement bill as it's currently stands, if we were to follow it to the latter, we might not be able to achieve some of the things that we've put ourselves, and therefore suggest that we need to go outside and invest in skills. And I think what Dr. Buthelezi raised earlier, we really do need to go out and find better skills in order to make sure that these projects that we have outlined, particularly infrastructure projects, we are able to achieve them and achieve them on time, and of course deal with cost issues that they get overrun over a period of time, because some of the problems necessarily are as a result that they are not within our purview. But to an extent that there's a disciplined investment of getting the right skills to make sure that our project become a success, that I think it's a critical commitment that forms part of our work. And I think going forward, working with yourselves and I think the colleagues in the NPC, particularly because almost all the SOEs infrastructure projects are here in Gauteng, we think there is a better way of getting those results such that how we procure for infrastructure must look into the objective conditions that we face within Gauteng. And what are those conditions? Those are problems of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So whatever investment that we're bringing into the space called Gauteng must assist us to solve some of those problems. And I think the experience that maybe Ryan is also raising would help us to solve the immediate problems. And the immediate problems I was saying earlier goes into where do we get the best skills to get us to build the hospitals on time in response to the peak of COVID-19? Where do we get the right skills to make sure that, in fact, if I was in a national department, I would have taken a decision that says, if Cape Town, KZN, a bit of Tegwini, and Gauteng are necessarily the epicenter of COVID-19, how do we rally around skills just on project management, implementation, and capability to make sure that all those proposed project investments in these provinces or these centers are realized and realized on time, so that post-COVID we can be able to pinpoint that outside of a different PMO model, we're able as a country to solve some of this problem whilst the bill is being spoken about. So for us, the long-term issues are critical, but I think in the immediate, we need to be able to say, what do we do now to make sure that we spatially transform our economy and indeed our spaces so that they're integrated in a manner that responds to the kind of society that we want. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mduduzi. I couldn't help being reminded as you spoke about the scene that I think many of us saw on our TV screens. I think it was Wuhan, China, right? Where that 10-day hospital was put together. I mean, I'm sure the skill is as good as Nasrec or elsewhere, but yeah, I think that goes to the immediacy that you're talking about right at the moment. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists, and even though Miriam's gone, and also to our presenters. So we've got a good little bit of time for some questions and answers. And there are some that have come through on the Q&A, and I'd encourage the attendees to use this time to put in more questions. Certainly, I've seen that some of our panelists and presenters have undertaken to respond to those questions, even if we are not able to actually verbally, to discuss them verbally here in the remaining time of the seminar. So, I'd encourage you to put in your questions. I'm going to, there's two that I'd like to single out at the moment, and Sean and Ron invite you to respond to, but other panelists might well wish to as well. One is, there were a couple of questions from Ncedo and Pat that I think cohered together. I'll actually read one from Pat here. Our students cannot connect with the market. I think it's a question about transformation in the construction industry. Our students cannot connect with the market due to lack of empowerment of enterprises in which these students can easily connect. Sadly, they are the first ones in their families who have a qualification. They end up being employed as fuel attendants, SAPs, police, tellers, etc., with degrees in construction. This talk is to a construction industry that is not transformed. A few 5% contractors are in the top tier who are multi-international and are doing 85% of the work. And then there's a reference, I think it's an academic reference to Milford, 2008. They collude, they do price fixing, tender rigging, etc. Why are we not producing papers that seek to transform the industry? And then there's another question here. Sean, I think it would be fair to say that you actually typed and answered it, although this is from Mike. I'm just picking this up again. Okay, yeah, here it is. I'd just like to read it out. Why do we do need to distinguish between private finance, I think he wrote 2 questions and you answered both of them. Maybe you can pick this up in the general discussion, Sean. I'll read his second question. We do need to distinguish between private finance, which is widely used by private enterprises, and PPPs, in which private sector finances, implements, and operates infrastructure services. So the distinction between private finance and then public-private partnerships. I would hope that this initiative focuses on improving public sector performance generally and not just PPPs, which require even stronger capacity in those, in clients, in the leadership of public sector. So Sean and Ron, I'd invite you and then any panelists to respond to those 2 questions.
Thank you. I think both of the questions are correct in terms of raising the issues. Our brief for our paper was to look at the goals and objectives in the NDP related to infrastructure, which relate to increasing expenditure and reducing under expenditure and improving the quality of infrastructure procurement. But I agree there need to be more papers done as well on other issues related to infrastructure, such as transformation. Mike is correct. The paper largely focuses on improving public government infrastructure delivery and procurement. It's not saying that because government has got challenges with this infrastructure procurement and delivery that therefore things should be done by the private sector. It's rather saying that government infrastructure procurement and delivery management needs to be improved for projects which are funded from the fiscus. But also, as indicated in the NDP, given our fiscal constraints and the huge demand for improved public infrastructure, it's important also to mobilize private savings to invest in infrastructure. And we identified the PPP framework as being one of the hurdles. That's why it was highlighted in the presentation as to one of the hurdles to increasing that private sector investment. And there is currently a PPP review process underway by National Treasury, which recognizes that that PPP regulatory framework has been disappointing in terms of its outcomes. It was hoped when it was put in place that there would be more private involvement in infrastructure where the public infrastructure where the private sector can get a return from that infrastructure which has sustainable revenues streams associated with it than has been the case. So there is a general recognition of that and that it needs to be changed. But apart from that, Mike's points are correct.
Just to pick up on some of the disappointing empowerment issues which Allison raised, as well as what was being asked in the questions. It is dealt with in the paper, but I think one has got to understand that if you're going to have empowerment, it has got to start with leadership within the client body. There has to be a desire to do it and to do it properly. We spoke a lot about tick boxing. Let me give you a quick example. We take the local content requirement. All it is a form that's added into a document and thrown out on a construction contract. Now, how many different materials are used? It's not buying one commodity. One has got a whole array of things that one is doing. You need to have not a tick box approach to procurement, and what we've been arguing for is a differentiated approach. If you had a specification for it, that all products that came onto the site, not just the one item that you're trying to do in a tick box in a single transaction, as the whole system is geared up for, one would have a better result. One has also got to have a client that is going to ask to see the evidence of what has happened, not just a 30% tick in the front. Okay, we can award the contract. You have to treat the socioeconomic imperatives in exactly the same way as that you'd have a technical requirement. You need a specification for it. It needs to be enforced. It needs to be monitored. It needs to be checked. In fact, all the systems were in place prior to coming, and were done through Public Works Department, through the affirmative procurement policy. There were specifications that arose even into international standards. And all of that came to a halt when the regulations for the Triple PFA Act came out and everything was brought back to a tick. What was happening at the acquisition stage? And this comes back to, if you think about procurement as a process which creates, manages, and fulfills, procurement is only over when the fulfillment has taken place. In other words, your contract has ended and all the socioeconomic deliverables have been reported on in exactly the same way as you've assessed the technical deliverables. We've got to have an integrated process. We can't have this buyer transaction only up front in awarding a tender. It needs to be cascaded right through to the end. And I think the frustration that the younger folk are having of not getting access to opportunities is because it's a tick box up front. It's not enforced all the way through. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to, I think each of our panelists, maybe let's go in reverse order from where they spoke before. Mduduzi, Ryan, Allison.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think one of the things that one would like to say is that there are critical institutions, if you like, departments that have got to work together if we are to achieve the efficiency in the delivery of infrastructure. Other than just having in the context of Gauteng, we've got the infrastructure department that has got to deliver infrastructure for health, for education, and maybe for social development. But what you then need in addition to that is that whatever infrastructure plans from a project preparation point of view are proposed, you have treasury from a point of view of budgeting. The second element you bring on point, which I think is the planning element, is partial referencing. Because part of the problem is that people tend to think we have presentations, PowerPoint presentations, but these PowerPoint presentations lie because you can't be able to even geocode a project. You can't even know where is this project. So one of the detailed improvements you've got to do going forward is to be able to say, we are building a hospital, this hospital is in Zola. You are also going to be able to do and bring in new innovations in our project management capability. And one of the former MECs in the Department of Infrastructure used to talk about drones. Can you be able to have drones and be able to know where is the project, where it's happening? The second related element is to be able to manage efficiency with regards to finances that you bring, that you are investing in to realize those projects. And that is something that I think we have to invest in. But I think the other critical aspect, which I think might also be lacking in the bill, or generally in the current processes of procurement, is transparency. One of the things we've introduced is open tender process. It's taking time, of course, but the intention is to be able to say to people, from a transformation point of view, you are able to see that this is the tender process, this is what it has happened, and you are able to even see each and every stage of that tender throughout its final allocation. The reason why I think the state must do that is to be able to avoid a situation where people think that tenders are made for these people or infrastructure is made for these or that people. So we've got to deal with those issues so that we bring in the aspect of integrity, because part of professionalization, as Sean was raising, must also include integrity of process of procuring infrastructure, including service and food in the state, so that the trust issues are also dealt with in the process. Yes.
Thank you. This might actually be a good point to also mention that I know PARI is planning to have another event sometime soon, although I think after the period for comments on this bill is over, an event on the launch of the position paper probably in July. And certainly we have some thoughts on integrity and transparency, which I think would broadly align with that. Very important, so thank you. Allison?
Jonathan, I don't have much to add other than to reiterate what Ron just said, is that, it's the checkbox approach that really adds to the fact that transformation hasn't really been brought about in a way that it should be. We need to see, not just formalistic transformation, but actual substantive transformation. And that's why I say the rules really need to be paid attention to, because there's a regulation in the 2017 PPPFA regulations that says subcontracting 30% of, I think, 30 million. And that arrangement is supposed to be to the benefit of your SMMEs. But if you look at what 30% is, it's about 9 million. And in terms of the CIDB grading, I can't remember the exact numbers. I think Ron and Sean will probably remember more clearly than I do. 9 million is high for an SMME, well, the really smaller guys. So, a rule like that really isn't to the benefit of the ones that really need it. So I think you're very right, Ron, in saying that, we need actual substantive transformation. Is this tick box attitude that makes us just, that leads to us not giving real meaning to that.
Okay. Ron, unless you want to say something there, Ron, we're on to Ryan. So Ryan, go ahead.
Sure. So, transformation increasingly in procurement is often, in my experience, just a synonym for kind of distribution of contracts through political networks, right? And what you're going to get when that's the case is people that aren't in political networks are going to be excluded, right? But also you're going to lose the checks and balances that ensure that there is delivery on contract, and that in the process, productive capacity is built in new enterprises, right? Another thing is that, we're often treating, we're increasingly treating the kind of transformation function of procurement as a kind of redistributive function rather than a developmental function, right? We have annual turnover in suppliers, rotations. We're breaking contracts up into smaller and smaller bits at the main level, at the subcontract level, and so on. These things are not necessarily conducive to the development of new enterprise capacities, right? Just to kind of reiterate what Ron was saying, the use of procurement to kind of develop new businesses needs to be, it needs to take a developmental approach. The concern needs to be with cultivating over long periods of time viable new businesses that can, ultimately compete on international scales and so on, right? What that means is you need longer term contracts. These need to be more relational, strategic. There needs to be more concern with what sorts of capacities are being built in these enterprises. And for all of that to happen, these relations between the state and the private sector need to be kind of freed of political interference. Politicians ought to set policy and set oversight and all that sort of thing. But once you have, contracts going to political connections, the chances that these contracts are going to be delivered without, manipulation and all that kind of stuff diminish. Right? So, in various ways, I think we need to understand what work is actually being done now with transformation, and we need to consider how to improve it so as to create viable businesses.
And Ryan, if I can just ask, I saw Sean nodding his head somewhat vigorously during your comments, if I got it right. But, when you're talking about the importance of long-term relationships and so on, are you thinking, infrastructure delivery specifically or throughout procurement? And if you can speak to that a bit.
Obviously it's kind of different depending on what's being bought. But, I think generally speaking, where we've decided to use procurement to develop new businesses, there needs to be a concern with understanding what these businesses need in terms of, duration of contract, but, a range of other things as well. to kind of build the capacities that need to stand on their own 2 feet over the longer term, right? So yeah, in infrastructure procurement, but also more broadly, you know, anything from textiles to you know, so on and so forth. Could go on for days.
Yeah, I think that's been something for me that's very interesting about exploring this area of infrastructure within procurement at more depth, is realizing a number of the themes that are very present in infrastructure are nonetheless important throughout procurement of goods and services. Okay, I've got 3 questions that I'd like to pose, since I'm the voice here, or the intermediary voice to some extent. These are actually, interestingly enough, well, to some extent, at least to a couple of the panelists. So Kalaletso says, it is interesting, Mduduzi, this is for you. It's interesting that Mr. Mbada raised plans that have been in place, but does not speak of links of service delivery in the regulations. Why is Treasury not part of the planning committees or commissions set at the Premier's office around infrastructure projects? And if they are, then clearly that is not reflected in the regulations set for infrastructure. If we also had coherence in spheres of government, then we should have a better procurement bill. So I think there's some specifics there, but also about intra-governmental cooperation. Arthur says to Ryan, Ryan, are you proposing a centralized procurement for infrastructure? And then another question here, which I think actually might be to PARI and Mandela Institute. Will the bill-related comments and views that have been raised be submitted to National Treasury as part of public comment submissions? I think I'll just say that we will certainly endeavor to do that as much as we can. I think there are other organizations and persons here who are preparing comments. Certainly PARI is doing that as well. So there's 2 specific questions to Mduduzi and Ryan, and who'd like to go first there?
Okay, I think it's the problem that I think we're finding ourselves in is that almost now, how many months? I mean, since February, there has been almost a stop as a result of the COVID-19, and some of the projects that we had planned had to be brought backward a bit. But what did we do over this period? Because I think there are lessons that we can share. One of them, from the old vision that we've had of being a city region, was just a coordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just as an example, I'm supposed to be in a meeting now at 3, Jonathan. In that meeting, it's the DG of the province, all heads of departments, 14 of them, and all city managers from the 3 metros and the 3 districts, the head of the police, commissioner, and all those other people in one room to say, as Gauteng city region, what is our response to COVID-19 pandemic? What is it that we need to do from an infrastructure point of view to respond to the demands of COVID-19 with regards to health, the demands with regards to classrooms? So we are planning together to an extent that everybody comes in to say, just as an example, if we have 15 billion rand in our kitty, how much of that must go into solving health? How much of that must go into solving schooling problems? And our implementing agents, which is the Department of Infrastructure, is able to put the necessary skills to get that going. Similarly, municipalities are doing the same. So in a way, we are working in a manner that is quite integrated and quite responsive. But this is also an old arrangement of the IGR Act, cooperative government, and so on and so on. But I think the observation that Sinai is making are such that it's because people can't see at the present moment the actual physical infrastructure But go to Nazareth, just use Nazareth. Nazareth, its success is also because City of Joburg is on board, makes a contribution. The clinics that we've been opening and supporting in the different districts are also because it's a combination of the partnership between the province and municipalities, but also national government. So that coordination is very, very important, so that I think the point that is being made, people must be able to see that when we go and intervene in a municipality like Mfuleni with all its problems, so that we avoid what Rian was raising, that we come into a place, you want to solve the water problems in the Val, it's already known that these are lined up for these people. So we have to deal with those perceptions, real and unreal, because we've got to deliver for all the people, but we've got to get the right skills in that particular region or across Gauteng so that we deliver efficiently. So I think we'll take the point up, but basically this is the model that we're adopting, and I've been saying this around to some of the guys, that you can't present to us a delivery of a new hospital on a PowerPoint presentation that does not even have the whole PMBOK project just to say start, finish resources, because that just reflects that we have the wrong people that are meant to deliver a project. So all those things are critical things that outside of the meeting that I'm telling you about of 3 o'clock, then the Premier sits daily with MECs just to say, if this project is to be delivered, what time, what are the resources? So it is that meticulous, efficient system that we're putting in place so that we don't fail, because post-COVID, you can't have corruption coming back. Rather, you must look back and say, you've delivered efficiently using experiences and expertise that exist in the system of government. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mduduzi. Ryan, I'm going to let you speak in just a minute. But looking at our time, I think I'd like to invite you, Ryan, to be the first of the summing up from the presenters and the panelists. And Ryan, I'm also going to, there's been a little bit of pushback, I think. Nsedo says Ryan's comments are not correct. Transformation is not the distribution of contracts to political networks. And Eunice says casting transformation as synonymous with access to politically connected is to trivialize transformation. Hopefully just your turn of phrase. So Ryan, this will be response to those questions and comments, and also your sort of closing comments. And I'd ask the other panelists and presenters to do that as well so that we end on time. Thank you, Ryan.
Sure. So on the kind of centralization, decentralization, you know, these debates kind of rage across the South African state. I think, you know, it's a bit of a red herring. In the sense that, you know, the decision regarding where you put the kind of procurement function is heavily dependent upon what work you're trying to do with it and so on, what you're buying, et cetera, et cetera. Some things that make sense to centralize and buy in bulk, some things it doesn't. That's just like a general comment on public procurement. In infrastructure, you know, I haven't looked in great detail, but I think I'm in favor of leaving infrastructure procurement in the organs of state where it is. And in many cases, that would be a kind of constitutional imperative, I think. But then to shift the kind of decision-making powers from, to some extent, you know, there can be oversight and all that kind of stuff, but the original kind of decision-making powers from the financial function over into infrastructure delivery end-user functions, right? Into water departments, sanitation departments, and so on. So I think with infrastructure procurement, I'm not really in favor of centralizing, although there may be some argument for more coordination through things like the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Council and so on. You know, on the transformation, you know, one thing I'm not saying is that we shouldn't transform. I think that's an imperative. That's also, in fact, a constitutional imperative. It's a kind of a basic commitment of the post-apartheid project. Right? But what I am saying is that it is the case that often the language of transformation is used to facilitate political access to contracts and to distribute these contracts through political networks. You know, that's fairly clear just from a you know, observation of what's happening in the state, right? So, you know, my language is not a concern with trivializing transformation. I'm in favor of a deepening and a more substantive process of transformation. I just think that once this becomes a process of just kind of political distribution of resources through political networks, then in certain ways the process of transformation is undermined, right? And I think that's the argument I'm trying to make.
Okay, thanks very much. I think part of those remarks also touch upon the question of institutional location, and it's touched upon a little bit in the questions here. We haven't been able to get into it in the discussion, but the mandates of CIDB, of the Presidential Infrastructural Coordinating Committee, of OCPO within Treasury, outside of Treasury, there's a lot of questions and issues there. So that's another discussion, or it could have been part of this discussion, but it certainly could also form another one. Let's see, who's up? We'll save the presenters for last. How about that? Allison and Mduduzi, you've just both spoken recently, but would either of you like a closing word here?
I think, Jonathan, the very last thing I wanted to say was just I'm happy to see, you know, this is what has been needed for the longest time, is that all of us coming from different perspectives in infrastructure, your engineers, your economists, your lawyers, your practitioners coming together and seeing what we can do to improve the industry as a whole. So thank you very much for hosting this. I think it was very, very rich, very informative, very interesting, thought-provoking as well. And I think we should take it forward, not just for it to stay a webinar, but for us to actually continue working together to bring about the change that we keep talking about. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a nice balance between just talking, but also doing. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe I should also say that Sean and Ron must come to Gauteng and just help us because they are quite knowledgeable just on getting some of these things done. See, what Ryan is raising is correct. Perceptions can also be a problem. We've got to confront them. So if you are a developmental state, you've got to be able to understand that some of the things have got to change. So COVID-19 is asking us to really press a reset button. There are a lot of things we've been doing and they have not been getting us results. One of them has been just not talking. One of them has not been appreciating skills across the system, irrespective of race and gender. And I think that that one has been just ignoring the fact that there's huge geography of inequality, and infrastructure is a critical element that we can use to solve some of these problems. So I'm looking forward to many people coming back to help us and also conversing about how best we can use infrastructure to transform the economy and society. Thank you.
Thanks, Mduduzi. Ron, Sean?
I think what I'd like to just sort of leave as a thought is I think the infrastructure bill has a tremendous starting point because it's grounded on value for money. And I think I should just qualify my understanding of value for money is best described by the 4 E's. Efficient, economic, and effective use of resources underpinned by equity to leverage legacy from infrastructure projects. And if we can do that, I think we can meet a lot of our developmental and social agendas. But it has to be done, as we've tried to point out through the papers, through client leadership, ownership of projects, taking responsibility, using the correct resources, and mobilizing with very, very clear goals and objectives in mind. And those include all the transformation agenda. So I think we're in a very good space, and as a starting point, I see we're on a journey in trying to shape this bill to where it goes. There's still big gaps for infrastructure, a blank space, as you said, Allison, the 3 pages. It needs to be filled out, but I think the foundation is there if we're all looking at value for money in the context that I've been talking about. It's not just the infrastructure, it's what is the legacy that's left behind at the same time. Thank you.
I think all these improvements are part of the broader public service reform process. The NDP emphasizes the need to professionalize the public service. I think that needs to be unpacked more. I think in a way we're unpacking this related to infrastructure. We're unpacking that term professionalize related to infrastructure, procurement and delivery management. One of the comments in the Q&A was that the key issue is that we need to improve government capacity. That's where the focus needs to be, to deliver and manage, which I think is correct. But I think the NDP could have unpacked more what it meant by professionalizing the public service, but that's where I think the focus needs to be.
Okay, thank you very much. Just from my point, thanks very much to all of you. I'm going to pass over at the moment to Mbongiseni, and thanks very much.
So I'd just like to make 2 points before thanking everybody. The first is I'm listening to the responses to particularly Ryan's input. It's quite clear to me that the question of transformation or empowerment lends itself, I think, quite well to us mishearing one another, and also, I mean, as one of the questions quickly went towards, was this question of what lies behind what is being said. Now, this points to me to an important thing, which is that the state has a critical role, and I think it links to what Sean has just said, a critical role to play in the transformation of society. Mduduzi has repeated this, has emphasized this repeatedly, and in the transformation of our economy. So I think it is critical that we are now redrawing the rules through this bill. The redrawing of the rules, I think what Ryan says in terms of how, as when we observe what is happening now, procurement lends itself to being used for political purposes. It partly suggests that the rules that we have perhaps have a bit of a misalignment, that we have an opportunity at this moment in the public procurement bill to begin to correct, to begin to close some of the loopholes that we've seen being exploited. Perhaps the manipulation that Ryan talked about has become necessary because the rules are not serving the purposes that certain people see in terms of transformation and in terms of empowerment. So I think we need to really think seriously about what that means, which then means I would like to encourage everybody to make submissions on this bill, on these issues that are quite of great importance and that people have raised here. That can draw quite emotive responses in some cases. It's important that we put in submissions and that we try and move towards the kind of bill that we want. The second point I want to make in closing is that we are also aware that in terms of the discussion around the bill itself, the closing of the comments is at the end of this month. But beyond that, I think there is a need for the conversation to remain alive, for these issues that have been aired here. And Allison made the point that people who are, from a range of disciplines have convened here to have this discussion. It's important that we keep this discussion alive as the bill is being threshed out. So in our own work, then Jonathan has already mentioned that the next thing we're going to do is launch our own position paper on public procurement. Sean has also mentioned that this is part of a broader set of work that needs to be done in terms of thinking about the transformation of the state, questions of professionalization, etc. We've done some of that work in other areas as well. So the paper that we're launching in the next webinar is part of a suite of 3 papers that PARI has done. Position papers, the other one is on professionalizing the bureaucracy in the state, which we launched about a month ago. And there's another paper that looks at institutions of the criminal justice system that we're not going to focus much on, but it's part of the resources available on our website. So all 3 of those papers are available on our website. A procurement paper is available for people to use as a resource if they wish to. And with that, let me then thank particularly our 2 presenters, Ron and Sean. And let me thank all the people who've commented, our panelists, Mduduzi, Allison, Miriam in her absence, and Ryan. And especially let me thank Jonathan for facilitating this discussion. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day.